We're also experiencing quite high fall-through rates, touching on nearly 30%. I'm going to start with you, Stuart. Now, I believe you bought your first leasehold flat in 1994, if I'm right.
Yeah, it did indeed.
And it took 6 weeks
It did,
to complete. Why did it take 6 weeks then and nearly 5 months now, in your opinion?
From a consumer perspective, it's relatively difficult to actually answer that question, because you end up thinking, well, the last time I moved, it took 3, 4, 5 months. And the first time I moved, which was obviously in 1994, it was genuinely 6 weeks from sale agreed to completion on the property. A bit of it probably had to do with the fact that we were first-time buyers at the time, so we were moving out of rented accommodation into our first property. But they do say that leasehold takes longer anyway. But at that time, it took 6 weeks for us to genuinely move house, and we had the keys and we'd moved in. Today, I think things are obviously radically different. Maybe the market is slightly more professional, maybe there's more checks and balances. Certainly the moves that I'm involved in are more likely to involve a chain, and I think that's one of the key issues. But 4.5 months, 5 months is approaching the point where the market's starting not to work for consumers, in my opinion.
Great. And Mark, to you next. Your businesses are at the heart of this. Why does it take so long to buy a property?
Let me first take slight issue with Stuart's 6-week example. The numbers we're talking about are averages, and there are still leasehold and freehold transactions that will go through in a few weeks. There aren't as many of them, but it can certainly be done in the right circumstances with the right chain. I think the reason why transaction lengths have extended by so much over the last few years, there's 4 or 5 different reasons actually. There isn't one single reason. The biggest one is the strain on the market and the system as a whole in terms of capacity. So if you go back to 2021, actually in real terms, conveyancers were needing to deal as a sector with something like 50-60% increases in work. Now there's very few sectors that can manage that, and the challenge is you can't just recruit lots of people because there's a training period to get people up to speed. So as a sector, we're not, as a housing sector, we're not terribly well equipped to deal with big fluctuations in volume. And it's not just conveyancers who were under pressure in that period. It's also lenders and their processing departments, it's local authorities, it's management companies. All of those sub-elements of the conveyancing process were all taking longer because all of those departments were busy. And the housing market really is a series of queues, the home moving process. And if there's too many people in the queue, everything will take longer. That's not to say that there aren't ways in which every element can be improved and efficiency can be gained. And there are lots of businesses that are doing lots of clever things to improve the efficiency of the operations, including ourselves using technology. As a market, it's a very fragmented market though. So for every large firm investing in technology, you've got probably several hundred small firms who do very little conveyancing. It's not their main activity, and their appetite to invest in those sorts of improvements might not be there. So it's not one single answer. I think the other element that maybe gets missed by some of the analysis is that during this period over the last few years, the lack of stock in the market has meant that chains, when they fall apart, it's harder to put them back together. There's less choice for those subsequent transactions. And the numbers that we're talking about, they factor in all of those fall-throughs and recoveries of chains, the hard work done by agents to bring stuff back together. And that's been tougher over the last couple of years. I'm hopeful that in a lower volume environment, some of those issues go away, but there's still a need for investment in technology and a serious look at some of the processes.
Yeah.
To be fair to Mark, you always have to look at this in the round, and we do collect a lot of legal searches data as well. So there are really 2 points that we've got eyes on, if you like. So the first one of those is the difference between the sale being agreed and the point in which the legal searches are done, obviously after the purchaser has engaged a conveyancer. And that point has elongated as well. So some of the increase in time has actually, with the lack of stock, has actually been down to chain forming. And just to explain that in a really simple way. If my property's up for sale and I sell it or agree a sale on that property, I've then got to go and find somewhere to live. And with the lack of stock, that process has taken an immeasurably longer amount of time than it has previously. And I do feel like and this is my honest opinion, it's slightly unfair that a lot of this gets levelled at the conveyancer's door when actually there was a whole bunch of actors, for want of a better phraseology, from the lenders, from the local councils, doing local legal searches and that kind of thing, experiencing delays, particularly in places like Stratford-upon-Avon, which can be like 15, 16 weeks. Even down to the removers, consistently changing the date because there's not enough of them in the marketplace. There was a lot of actors that struggled with the period that we had in 2021 going into 2022.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's many cogs to the home moving process, and if I log on LinkedIn over the last year, there's been a bit of bashing from estate agents to conveyancers and conveyancers to estate agents and vice versa. But you throw in lenders and search companies and removals, as you say, it is a fairly complicated process. Now,
even before the pandemic, the one other thing I didn't mention was the work involved in a conveyance has increased. The demands of lenders and the number of things that conveyancers now have to check, it's increased over a period of time. So we're not comparing apples with apples when we look at timescales and activity going back 5 or 6 years. It's a harder job, notwithstanding all the other stuff that we just talked about.
Yeah, I'd agree. And Martyn, I'll perhaps come to you next. I think the truth is there's good and bad in any industry. There's very good estate agents and very good conveyancers, and there's the minority that perhaps bring some of the industry down. But from an estate agency point of view, you've been an estate agent for many years and you speak to many estate agents and train them. What do you think estate agents can do to play their part in removing the length of time it takes?
Okay, we've covered lots here, haven't we? Because you look at a leasehold property, I'd say that maybe when a leasehold property comes to the market, the estate agent gets the heebie-jeebies, let alone some of the conveyancers, Do they really understand what is involved with selling a leasehold property? Do they understand that they need to be talking to their seller about getting a management pack whilst they're marketing the property? So there's a lack of understanding in some sectors. It doesn't mean they're bad agents or good agents, but there's a lack of understanding on things like getting that information up front on those leasehold properties. I'm going to take issue with you, Paul. I don't think that when you get down to the grounds of it and you turn off some of the trade press, that estate agents and conveyancers really have got this mentality of headbutting up against each other. And there's actually areas all around the country where they are collaboratively working together. But we have to remember that we're dealing with a piece of legislation that is 100 years old and arguably could be modernised if not necessarily not fit for purpose. I'm sure we'll go into this conversation and discussion and talk about Scottish ways of doing things or how it's done in the States or in New Zealand or Australia. But there is lots that an estate agent can do to try and make life not easier for the conveyancer, but get information ready, getting properties sales ready during the marketing process that will speed up the process once we get a memorandum of sale out. If that's using something like a Property Mark sales preparation kit or just getting information together with a property information questionnaire, which they need to do to cover themselves under consumer protection and fair trading regulations, they can get all that information together and deal with some of those issues before we even get through to the conveyancing side. Maybe even just filling out a memorandum of sale correctly with all the correct details on there will stop draft contracts going out with the wrong information out there. I'm sure there's lots actually, and I think we could sit here, Mark, all day and say that we could pick the points where there's actually crossover between what a good quality estate agent brings to the table and get the information they gather. Then that has to be done again when the conveyancing process starts.
Completely agree, and I think the earlier that you can identify risk points in a transaction, the better. The balance, I think, is between how much work, cost and time goes into that up front, and whether it's always valuable, because not everything is a critical path item, not everything is a risk item, but I think the good agents can spot the potential sources of difficulty and flag those up, and that's always helpful when it happens. And absolutely, great sales memos. It's been a bugbear of colleagues of mine for many years. A really good sales memo can really help in terms of setting a transaction up for success from day one.
Great. I want to move on to Scotland, actually. We got a brief mention earlier. So obviously Scotland has a different legal system and a way of working. But from the data that Stuart's team look at, the time to exchange in Scotland is quite significantly lower than the rest of the UK. Mark, perhaps just touch on some of the key differences between the Scottish legal system in England and Wales. And I'm wondering if there's anything we can learn from Scotland to help in England and Wales and Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we don't operate in Scotland, so I'm not going to comment on the absolute detail of it. But I think, and it's less different than it used to be. Certainly, there was a long period where chains simply weren't a feature of the Scottish market. So this perception that it's a much quicker process partly has been down to that. I was actually surprised by the data at how little difference there was. It's about 20% faster from the point of sale agreed to exchange. But of course, before a sale can be agreed in Scotland, a home report's got to be prepared at a cost of £400 to £500. It takes a few weeks to do that. So if you were actually measuring the time from thinking of moving to moved, the difference actually would be less than we're talking about. And this is my particular bugbear about some of these conversations about different systems. We've got to be honest about what we're comparing. There's no silver bullet in this, whether it's upfront information, whether it's vendor disclosure and binding contracts on offer. There are implications for all of those. So when people cite Australia as an example, it's a different market in which if you want to move and you can't buy before you sell, you're going to need to get bridging finance, you're going to need to move into rented accommodation. Now that's a choice for us as a country to say, on balance, for most people, would that be preferred to chains? And yes, some of the downsides that go with that, but the flexibility that they bring to the market. And on balance, a better functioning conveyancing process at the right volumes, I believe is preferable, and the existence of chains, I believe, is preferable to the much more radical approach of, yes, you can move, but you're going to have to move into rented, or you're going to have to get bridging finance, because as a country, we're not set up for that.
Right.
So capacity, I think, comes back to being an issue time and time again, doesn't it? Certainly from a conveyancing point of view. And we only need to look at when Dishy Vishy gave us our incentives and getting stamp duty holidays and deadlines, that whilst transactions did take place, it was a buckling system that just couldn't cope. And actually, you tell me, saw some good members of the industry say, that's it, I'm done, and walk away. So it actually became more of a problem. So capacity has got to be addressed. And Mark has a very successful business in this sector and has been has led the way in sort of innovation within the industry. So it's unfair to necessarily point this at Mark, but until we get to a point where conveyancers start charging the correct amount for conveyancing, so that therefore wages can be correct within the industry, and heaven forbid, I'm trying to say this to my industry, don't do this race for the bottom on fees, because you only need to look at what's been happening in the conveyancing industry over the last 10, 15 years. Until we address the problem of capacity, and as you say, it's not just training, but it's also attracting people into that industry, we're never going to solve this, are we?
I think that's certainly part of the issue, and it's been encouraging over the last few years to see that actually conveyancers across the market have increased their prices to try and reflect the work involved. The challenge now is making sure that people hold the line, and in a period where actually cases might be harder to come by, and the natural impulse of some businesses will be to compete hard on price. What we really want is to be competing on service and on consistency and on speed, and price as an incidental. But I think you're right. It's a really big challenge though when you look at it in that way, because the time it takes to breed conveyancers, depending on their route into the industry, it's a long-term issue, and in a market that's consistently fluctuating, where firms need to compete to survive, you can't dictate pricing, and I think the market simply won't accept some of the more traditional approaches to pricing that might have been the case 20 or 30 years ago.
And interesting, in Australia, the estate agency prices are relatively high compared to what they are in the UK.
Great. So Looking at it perhaps from a consumer's point of view, I think it's quite interesting. So I think consumers, don't understand what's involved and get quite frustrated when they say, why does it take 5 months? And I think a big part of that is perhaps lack of communication or lack of understanding from the consumer's part, which is, there's blame probably at different stages of that process. Now, as we mentioned earlier, there's lots of people involved in the moving process: estate agents, conveyancers, lenders, valuers. Now, the positive news is I'm seeing lots of solutions in how all these parties can work together. Now, we touched on technology earlier. I think there's lots of technological advances. So 20EA ourselves, we're connected with View My Chain, which allows people visibility of the whole chain. There's other solutions out there, and there's lots of other companies trying to do the same thing. So perhaps how can the various actors within the transaction work better together? Perhaps Mark, from a technology point of view, perhaps could you give a summary of some of the things you're doing or seeing within this space?
I mean, I'd agree with Martyn in that actually there is an awful lot of really great cooperation and collaboration that's already going on across the sector, and it starts with people. It starts with lawyers and agents communicating, and the technology is an aid to that. So the technology that we've had for a large number of years is about transparency of progress and transparency of inputs, and that's something that's now much more common. So for agents to be able to see what's going on a transaction and therefore not need to phone the conveyancer and take up their time asking them a question that they could see the answer to on a portal, that's a really valuable time saver for everybody involved. And the more sophisticated those platforms are, the more valuable they can be. I think there is a danger that when you have superficial information, actually all it does is it triggers more questions and more calls. So the deeper those systems can go, the better. I think that the data and technology side of it is really just beginning. This idea that we can take the available data up front and identify risk points in a transaction in a much quicker, easier way, using rules-based analysis of some of that data. There are already a number of solutions out there that are starting to do that. And there are opportunities to use AI to speed up some of those quite time-intensive processes within conveyancing as well. So there's an awful lot happening. I think the risk that a lot of the solutions carry, though, is the idea that they are a silver bullet that's going to solve everything, because I've not seen one yet that qualifies for that. I think there are a number out there that have something to contribute to the process, but there's nothing that's transformative yet.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think people are still very much at the heart of this issue with technology to aid that. I mean, Martyn, from your point of view, how have things changed from perhaps when you first started with estate agency in this transparency issue?
It's just harder work, isn't it? But but as we were just saying, if we've got a capacity issue, so therefore we're still a cottage industry, therefore we're still a people business, therefore people will, in all the way through the transaction, want to be talking to a good quality conveyancer, a good quality estate agent, a good mortgage broker, lender. It's going to be people buying from people. It's a people business, so therefore it's transparency, communication and education that's going to solve the problem if we can't alter the structure. So all of the prop tech solutions out there, until one of them gets critical mass and is able to influence the whole of the market, we've got relationships that are going to make the difference. So if you speak to a consumer, they don't understand the process. They don't understand how, when their mom and dad bought a property 25 years ago, they could get it exchanged through within 6 weeks, and we've not got, and it's now taking 149 days, 5 months. They don't understand what do they need, what needs to happen, what elements are going through, what transparency can we get out there to be able to help them. And I think if there was an understanding, then it would become less stressful. As an estate agent, the amount of time you put a deal together and they say, when do you think I'll get my key to my new house? 4 weeks, 6 weeks? And as soon as you turn around to them and say, 149 days, according to these fantastic statisticians, then it's deflating, isn't it? They've got all excited and it's deflating. And I'm buying a property at the moment. I'm right in the middle of it. There's no upward chain. There's no downward chain. and I agreed to sell in September. Well, we're now filming in the end of February, and I've not got the keys yet. And I think I picked a good conveyancer and a half decent estate agent. You know,
I think there's a real tension between actually managing expectations of clients, which obviously a big part of what agents need to do, and expecting the best. You know, I'm going through a process at the moment, and I've had regular conversations with the agent saying, well, we're going faster than the average. And my view is, I don't care. I don't care what the average is. You know, I want my move to move through more quickly. And there is this danger, I think, that when you set expected timescales, that's what everyone ends up working to. So I'm hoping that in a lower volume environment, actually, we all become a bit more demanding again, and a bit more proactive in chasing stuff through. I think completely understandable over the last few years why good agents will have backed off a bit, because if the conveyancer's not had the capacity to drive stuff through more quickly, then, you know, shouting at them down the phone isn't actually going to change that.
But from a consumer perspective, though, I mean, you mentioned Australia earlier, and, you know, maybe we don't want to go down that marketplace. And if you look briefly what's happening on the letting side in the UK at the minute, arguably that's a bigger problem for the government, because of the fact that the unaffordability of lettings in the private rental sector and the lack of stock is absolutely massive at the minute. So that's not going to solve the issue. And apart from collaborating at the front end, if you think about sort of 5, 10, 15 years time, I'm really interested to know both of your opinions on what you think should happen next, if that makes sense. How do we move from this process that we're in, where it takes 5 months and almost a third of properties fall through, or we're approaching that narrative now? I mean, it's a messy situation.
If you actually break down the conveyancing process and look at the constituent parts, there's an awful lot of time goes into dealing with lenders, responding to lenders, getting redemption figures from lenders, and all of those things take longer than they should do with most lenders, frankly. So actually having lenders with an appetite to improve their side of it could make a really big difference. And applying technology to some of those other elements that can take time, whether it's inquiries, whether it's title checks, there are solutions emerging to support in each of those areas. But the elephant in the room here is we are a sector made up of 4,000 active conveyancing firms, and 2,000 of them barely have a full-time person doing conveyancing. Yeah. So their appetite for adoption of expensive technology solutions is going to be pretty low. And you can move some of the market through, but there's going to be a big chunk of the market where that's more challenging. But you can't lose that part of the market. It's a really important part of the market. There's some brilliant people doing work in that part of the sector, and they provide the capacity that allows everything to flow through. So when we talk about what can government do to make a difference, the one thing they have to do is think long term and plan for a glide path into a new way of working, because anything that happens too quickly could have really counterproductive results.
I mean, it is possible to move people in 8 weeks, isn't it? With change in
it's possible to move people in 2 weeks. I mean, the reality is that transactions can happen really quickly in the right circumstances. That's not always what clients want. Again, some of the delays are, I'm not ready to move yet. I'm sitting on my hands for a couple of weeks. So not all of the delays are at the feet of the conveyancer. I think the routine differences, though, if you take Scandinavia as another example, again, completely different system, completely different lending environments, completely different attitude to agents are valuers in take Norway as an example. Agents are valuers in Norway. They get paid a lot more money, but the valuation that the agent does is relied upon by the lender. So all of that stuff through the process disappears as an issue. And as I say, the bridging finance is available and cost effective. So it's really difficult comparing the different geographies unless you're willing to engage with the choice for the consumer isn't perfection versus 140 odd days. It's a different set of choices that may or may not be preferred.
Which means that we may just need to get back to where we were pre-pandemic and when you bought your property in 6 weeks. But just going back to your question about government, or is there an appetite for government intervention and government legislation? There has to be acknowledgement that there is a huge amount of duplication between what estate agents are doing at the front end of and the information that conveyancers need later on. I think I agree with Mark in lots of ways in the fact that we can't compare ourselves to all different countries because there's lots of different circumstances behind each country. But what we can acknowledge is that we've come up with half a dozen countries that have got this nailed better than we have, in the fact that in terms of time frame, if you just take time frame as they're getting people moved quicker. In readiness for today, I spoke to some colleagues of mine who are over in the States. They were talking 49 days from offer to closure, but the estate agent or the realtor does a lot more of the process than we do over here. The problem we have, if we do not, we need to be tackling things like duplication. We need to be tackling the fact that a buyer or a seller can change their mind on if they're going to proceed or on the price that they're prepared to pay or accept right the way through it to exchange of contracts, messing people about. It's just immoral and incorrect. We need to be shortening down the time from agreeing an offer to an exchange of contracts, because you'll never tackle fall through rates properly until we do. We've had a period over the last couple of years where buyers have had FOMO, fear of missing out. So for the house of the market, you'd have 30, 40 viewings, multiple offers, best and final offers, and proceed with your best buyer. But what we're seeing now is the market's cooling, and your data shows that demand for property is starting to fall slightly. Is we're having, instead of FOMO, we're having FOOP, fear of overpricing, FOOP, fear of overpricing. And people are changing their minds now, not because they're perhaps thinking, oh, there's another house come to the market and I fancy that one more than this one, or I've just got cold feet or changed my mind, or actually I'm putting the news on and I'm hearing that prices are falling, so I'm now getting the heebie-jeebies again this way. So no wonder fall-through rates are increasing, and that won't change until we bring down that 149 days to a more acceptable level.
Yeah, just on fall-through rates, I think, Stuart, your data shows that I think in January 23, fall-throughs were about 27%.
27%.
And it was 23% last year, and much of that's for the reasons Martyn just outlined. I'm interested, reservation agreements I'm seeing more and more, which the argument is reduces fall-through rates quite significantly, and I know there's many agents that are using them quite successfully. And have people got views on that in terms of kind of tying in that buyer more to that offer?
I think reservation agreements are something that's worth exploring. There isn't critical mass. It's another layer of unknown quantity to the consumer. When somebody doesn't know too much about it, they'll perhaps refer to their legal expert for advice on it, which could again take time and expense, and actually spend as much time trying to get that reservation agreement correct as actually getting the deal done in the first place. So again, I think it's something that should be put on the table as considered, which, as long as there is a penalty to stop people from walking away from a deal quite as scot-free as they are at the moment.
Great.
I think, just to add to that, I think the challenge with reservation agreements is if there's significant skin in the game, then you're not going to want to sign the agreement until you're confident about the purchase that you're making, which in terms of the conveyancing process is about the same time as you would be ready to exchange. If there isn't skin in the game, if it's a relatively nominal figure that you're committing to, then do you feel more morally obliged to stick with it, having, the risk of losing 250 quid or 300 quid than you would do if you didn't have a reservation agreement in the first place? And arguably, there's a risk that if there's a known penalty, might that make you more ready to walk away and accept the penalty than to have the sort of moral jeopardy of having agreed something and then walked away. I've been a victim of this in the last few months. And it's absolutely soul-destroying when you're so close to a transaction and someone walks away at the last minute. The individual in question had really good reasons for wanting to do that personally. And a reservation agreement is always going to have to cater for those types of scenarios, real sort of personal and family issues that mean you can't go ahead with a transaction. So to destroy someone financially as a consequence of something outside their control also doesn't feel like the right thing to do, and often wouldn't be what a lawyer would advise the client that's in their best interests. So I think there are some real challenges with it. There are definitely circumstances in which reservation agreements are much easier to work with. If you don't have uncertainty about the property that you're buying, if you know it inside out and there's no risk attached to that side of it, then it could be a no-brainer. But I think it's a subset of the market at the moment. As you say, it's not mainstream.
Great. So I think just finally to touch on what the outlook is for the rest of the year. No, I've said previously, no one has a crystal ball, but it'd be just interesting, I think, for estate agents listening to this, just to see what we think's going to happen. I think transaction volumes, are almost certainly going to go down quite significantly. There's going to be less transactions going through. Do you think that will help speed up the process for the rest of the year, or do you think there's other factors at play?
I think it will start to improve the process, not least because some of those component parts that feed into the conveyancing process, lender, admin departments, local authorities, will be under less pressure and their turnaround times will be improved. Conveyancing businesses are having to look at their capacity at the moment because a lot of businesses are very quiet right now. And the challenge, I think, will be later on in the year if volume starts to pick up, do we find ourselves under pressure as a sector again? Because as Martyn mentioned earlier, there's an awful lot of good people have left the sector and are continuing to leave the sector because the pressure that they've been under for the last few years has made them decide it's not where they want to be.
Great.
Estate agents need to control what they can control. So start working with good conveyancers and get out there and see them. Do something old-fashioned, like go for lunch, see the whites of their eyes, meet them, have a conversation with them. They need to be making sure that they're getting as much information as possible and hitting those potential hurdles coming down the tracks early doors while they're marketing the property, because they're going to have longer times to work that out because they've been marketing the properties for longer. They're going to be making sure that there's relationships with not only good conveyancers but good mortgage brokers, so that there's more likelihood the deal's going to stay together because those people will work closer together. And make sure you fill out your memorandum of sale correctly so that actually you can control the information that's being passed on to the next party. That's what, because if there's going to be a lack of transactions or there's going to be a drop in transactions this year, which there is, then we need to give ourselves the best chance possible of getting the deal over the line. And so control what we can control.
Great. And I think on that note, let's leave it there. I think to summarise, I think I'm feeling quite positive. There's lots of good conversations happening between all the various parties. There's lots of solutions on the table, and I think hopefully in years to come we will have cracked this topic and we won't have to debate it anymore. So you can only dream. But Mark, Martyn, Stuart, thanks very much for joining me today. It's been really, really interesting, really insightful. So thank you very much.